Let's start the recording. Hi, everybody. Welcome. It's nice to see so many of you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I think I can give a brief introduction about Jason in a couple of minutes because we still have people coming in. Okay, shall we start, Jason?
Yeah, please do.
Okay, so welcome everybody. I'd like to thank Jason Anderson for accepting our invitation to do a webinar for us. He was really kind to accept our offer. I'd like to give a brief introduction about Jason Anderson. Jason is a teacher educator, author, educational researcher, and consultant with experience supporting teachers and developing materials for use in over 30 countries worldwide. And he has won a number of awards for his writing and his research. He's currently working at the University of Warwick, and his research interests are they include teacher expertise, teacher reflection, teaching methodology, and multilingualism in teaching. I think I can go on for another 2 or 3 minutes talking about Jason, his books, and he was personally, this is important to me. He was my trainer in training. So I learned a lot from him, and hopefully we will continue learning more from him today. So thank you, Jason. And the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And lovely to see as well, Bashak as well here, who was also a trainer on that course as well. So it's nice to be back. I'm kind of back in Ishkisi here in Anadolu because I enjoyed my time there so much. We had a wonderful course, amazing participants. Do you remember them, Kadir, Bashak?
Yeah.
They were brilliant. And I learned so much from working with you guys. So it's my pleasure. And thank you to you, to Umit and Mehmet as well, for having me here and for doing this webinar. Thank you most of all to the teachers for coming along. We're all very busy nowadays. I know how challenging it is can be to find time to do this. So I really appreciate you being here. There's time for a couple of activities, which I'll share as I go along, and we'll use a combination of breakout rooms. And if you're in a room with someone else, you can also use that for the discussions. So let me just share my slides. There we go. Okay. And just choose the one to share. There we go, that one. Okay, hopefully you'll be able to see my slides. As always, I sometimes lose something as I share my slides, and I can't see so many people, but I can see some of your faces, which is really useful. Thank you. If you can keep your cameras on, it's always useful to know what people are thinking. That visual feedback I find is so important and useful when we're giving talks. And feel free as well to use the chat throughout. As I've mentioned there, I always enjoy using the chat myself during webinars, and it's a nice way for you to give feedback and to share thoughts as well. All the participants, and just, there we go, that's great. Oh, yes. I'm just messing about with the participants so I can see as many of you as possible. That's great. Okay, that'll do. Right. Okay. So hopefully you can see the slide. Kadir, can you just confirm that everyone can see that slide there? The first slide.
Yeah. We can
Great.
see the slide. Yeah.
Excellent. Great. So I've called the talk Cooperative Learning, Making Group Work and Pair Work Effective. And Kadir, when we were preparing the workshop, we I understand that we contacted some of you to find out some of the issues that might be of use. And one of the choices that we discussed and found important was this question of how do we make pair work and group work effectively in the classroom? And it's not an easy thing to do. It's one of those things that we talk about a lot, we do a lot, and yet we often have challenges with. And I think those challenges are completely natural. But before we begin, and I'll come back to the quote you can see there a little bit later in the talk by Kurt Levine. Let me just find out a little bit more about you. So second slide, can you all just type your names in the chat? It's just lovely to see people and to have people talking. Get your hands nice and warmed up. Nice to meet you. Oh, there's Mehmet as well. Thank you. Already met. Esra, Berna, Gökhan. Sinem, Meral, lovely. Nice to meet you all. Ersin, Aysinur, Julia, Barish, Yurika. Wow, great. So much, so nice to have you all. Thank you. Now, a slightly more challenging question. What's your hometown? Are you all from Eskişehir? Where are you from? And is anybody from outside of Turkey? Adana, Eskişehir, okay. Awesome names I can't pronounce. Someone from Istanbul, my favorite city in the world. Shivash, Kastamonu, I don't know where that is. Alper, Antalya, that sounds nice. Right, great, cool. Next question. How many years of teaching experience do you have? Just type a number in the box. It's always useful to know. 25, wow, same as me. I'm about 27 now. So I'm older than you. Oh, 28, Errol has got more than me, more than Errol. 12, 19, so really experienced practitioners. They say teacher expertise, you need at least 7 years of extensive experience in one context. So I think we're working with expert teachers here. Great. And what's your favorite teaching activity? Just write any word in the chat that comes to mind. Difficult one. I like doing dictogloss sometimes. I don't know why. I just enjoy the challenge of that activity. Quite teacher-centered, but students always seem to learn lots from it. Dictogloss. Let's see. Mingle activities. Excellent. That will be part of it. Debates. Something I love. Gökhan is interested in task-based language teaching. Jeopardy, Berna. Excellent. Discussions, speaking info gaps. Oh, interesting. Some of these will come up today, and Ilknur, find someone who. Thank you. Great. Cool. So let's have a look at some of the. Oh, before we look at the aims of the topic, this is something which I say experienced teachers always know this, but it's good to share anyway. Always be critical of other people's ideas from your classrooms. I have worked with students, obviously, at Anadolu University, so I know a little bit about your context there, but we'll all be teaching and working in different contexts throughout our lives, and we always need to ask ourselves these questions. Will other people's ideas be relevant for my classroom? Will they be feasible? Will I have time to do them? And will I need to adapt them? And all of those things are important. And we could even add the question, will those my line managers, will they approve of what I'm doing? And it's important always to make sure that they're happy with that as well. So some important criticality there. Keep that in mind always as you participate in somebody else's talk, such as mine. So the aims, I kind of identified 5 broad aims. We'll have opportunities to reflect on the challenges that we face when doing group work and pair work in the classroom. We'll critically examine how we do these things as well. So we'll do both of these. Hopefully, we'll develop our understanding of what cooperative learning is and the theory of learning behind it. And I'll make the link between group and pair work and cooperative learning much clearer in a moment. We'll also review the research evidence for cooperative learning. How do we know it works, and how can we be certain that it works in my context? And we'll also evaluate a range of cooperative learning activities and strategies. So there we go. Now, let's begin first of all with our first main discussion activity, pair and group work challenges. We often refer to closed pair work and group work as collaborative learning in CLT, communicative language teaching. And these are separate terms, and I'll come back to them in a moment, collaborative and cooperative. But we often refer to the activities that we call pair and group work as collaborative learning. In such like activities, each learner is working or interacting with one or more of their peers outside of the direct control of the teacher, which is what I mean by closed groups, as opposed to, say, a pair of students performing for the rest of the class to observe. Closed groups are where everybody is in one group with a small number of participants. So 2 questions. What challenges do you face when doing pair work and group work activities in your classes? And what do you, the teacher, do during such activities? Do you just wait for them to finish? I don't think so. I'm sure you don't. But what kind of things do you do? Those are questions for you to discuss. I've put here, share your thoughts in the chat. But what I'd like you to do first of all, and Kadir, I think will be able to help here, is to put you into breakout rooms, unless you're already in a space with somebody else who you're comfortable discussing with, in which case feel free not to join a breakout room. We'll give this about 5-7 minutes discussion time, Kadir, if that's okay. And then about at the end of that, maybe after 4 or 5 minutes, maybe share 1 or 2 thoughts. Just put number 1 and name the challenge, or number 2 and name what you do, so I can get some feedback as well. It may be possible for me to join some of the groups. I'm not sure if that will be possible, but we will see. Okay, let's begin.
Jason, would you like pairs or small groups for the breakout?
Small groups, if we can do groups of 3 to 4, that would be great.
Okay, all right.
I was just saying, Sinem, thank you for that. Please write any thoughts you have in the chat. Just write number 1 if you want to answer the first question, and number 2 if you want to answer the second one. While you're doing that, I'll share some of the interesting ideas I got in my breakout group. I was with Ersin, and we discussed some of these questions. Great. Okay, I think everyone's back. Great. Okay, guys. Yeah, I was just saying, write your answers in the chat to either of those questions. Just brief notes. No need for writing a novel, but just 1 or 2 thoughts about, write number 1 for a challenge you face, and number 2 for some of the things you do during the activities. So, for example, when I was chatting with Ersin, Ersin gave me permission to mention this. One of the challenges that he faces is motivation of the learners, where you've got one student who isn't as motivated as the others to participate in the group. That's always a challenge that I hear. Another one that I thought was particularly relevant, not so difficult in Ersin's classes that are fairly small, but when we work in bigger classes, for example, those of you who do large group lectures or even work in secondary education, following each group, knowing what they're doing, making sure they're on task is really challenging. And Ersin also mentioned some really nice ideas for what he does during the activities. With his notebook, he walks around noting down not just errors, but some of the creative ideas to discuss afterwards. And I really like that, Ersin. So thank you so much for that. Yeah, and let's look at some of the challenges you've got here. So it's difficult always to gloss over them and kind of come up with 1 or 2, but I noticed a couple of you mentioned, yeah, losing interest, Ilknur, need more explanation, not being on task, really typical. Some students are willing to speak. This is the motivation question, right? Students tend to switch to Turkish in these activities, and we often see this in what I call a shared L1 class. They're sometimes called monolingual classes. I reject that term because they're bilingual, but I call them shared L1. And sometimes using other languages can really help us to learn. I hope we all know about the relevance and importance of translanguaging today, but too much Turkish when the aim of the activity is to practice English can be a problem. So yeah, several of you mentioned that as well. Early finishers again, what to do, what we do exactly when we monitor as well. And we'll come back to that. Yep, some groups finish quickly and others don't. And Barish, some don't want to go away from their comfort zone. In a way, that's also a motivation issue that they're not challenging themselves. Talking off topic, in other words, not on task. So we can see the same things. And somebody else mentioned there about level differences between students. Not so much of a problem when we put them into groups according to ability level, but if we work in secondary school classrooms, that is particularly noticeable. For example, when they get to a higher secondary, and some of them are really improving their English skills quickly, and others less so. And the complex correlation between that and motivation as well. Yeah. Oh, yes, and resistance to work with others than their close friends. Thank you for that, Sevgi. Yeah, great. Cool. Some really interesting nice points there. And Barish there is mentioning monitoring and taking notes for general feedback. I think we all do that, this active monitoring, as I call it. Great. Okay. Let's now move on to, do I need to reshare? I do, don't I? Yeah. Okay. Let me share my screen again. Thank you for that, guys. Now, where have the participants gone? There they are. Great. Okay, cool. So, where do group work and pair work in education come from? Let me now make the link clear to cooperative learning. Well, if you can see from this Google Ngram, which is an app you can use to check on the frequency of words in published books, the term group work begins to gain importance in the 1940s. And this is in English language literature. Obviously, I'm talking about in Anglophone language, in the Anglosphere, as it's sometimes called. And pair work, in fact, a lot later and still not as commonly used. Importantly, the term group work doesn't just exist in education, it exists in other contexts, and that's particularly important. But early references in education come from the so-called progressive schools movement in the USA, going right back to the 1890s, particularly laboratory schools of Francis Parker, who was a massive influence on John Dewey, who you may know about, but also in Dewey's work soon after, right at the turn of the 20th century. But it became more mainstream, if you like, during the cooperative movement in the USA in the 1960s. Pretty much for the first half of the 20th century, what Dewey and his colleagues were doing was only kind of drawn upon by a small number of progressive schools, Montessori schools as well, sometimes. Um, so what is cooperative learning and where does it come from? Well, it evolved in mainstream education in the USA, and it reached its peak of popularity back in about the late 1980s and early 1990s, although it started quite a bit earlier. It has its roots in the work of John Dewey, as I've just mentioned, but also in two important psychologists, Kurt Lewin and Morton Deutsch, who both worked primarily in business-oriented contexts. In other words, they weren't working in education. Their work, and I'll come back to some important quotes by these two very authoritative, important figures. Kurt Lewin was also the originator of action research out of interest. In the 1960s and early 1970s, an important thing happened in the USA called desegregation, when it was recognized that separating children of different colors, of different races, as they were calling them then, was not appropriate, and that they wanted to have mixed race classes in the USA. Desegregation was a massive problem because a lot of people were opposed to it. And there was a lot of racism at that time, which caused people not to want their children to study in classes together. And at that time, a number of psychologists were looking at ways to integrate and build rapport among learners who had been previously segregated, learners with very different prior educational experiences in the same classroom. And as a result, they tried to develop the cooperative learning theory to ensure that it works in what we can call heterogeneous classes. And heterogeneous doesn't just mean classes of mixed race, but students, but also classes which are heterogeneous in terms of, for example, male and female students together, boys and girls, students from a range of different backgrounds, and also inclusive classrooms that allow all students to study in the same room together. And in this sense, it remains very relevant as a methodology. Now, cooperative and collaborative learning aren't necessarily the same thing. So a little bit of clarification of the difference. Again, a Google Ngram can tell us that cooperative learning as a term was actually used much more often first, but collaborative learning seems to have become more popular more recently. And that's interesting as well, I think. Well, both of these terms are used by people who believe that learners can and should learn from each other, not just from the teacher. That's kind of the most important underlying principle. Cooperative learning is a specific methodology. It has principles and research evidence supporting it. And I'll come on a little bit later in the talk to mention some of the most important figures in it. Collaboration or collaborative learning are more recent terms, and there is no specific, if you like, theory of learning behind them other than simply the fact that we can and should do activities in pairs or groups. There's lots of kind of vague writing about it and reference to it in reference to learner-centered education. But in itself, there isn't necessarily the same movement behind it, the same principles underpinning it, and the same research base. A lot of the time, researchers tend to assume the terms are synonymous and they draw on them together. But I would argue that the underlying principles of cooperative learning, i.e. the earlier methodological movement, are often overlooked in more generic uses of the term collaborative learning. So let's have a quick look at an important kind of set of principles underpinning this. And here I'm going to go back to those two early researchers on group work and why it was important. And remember here, they're not talking about education alone. They're talking about working in groups in other situations. So if we ask, what is a group in psychological terms? A group isn't simply, and we often talk about groups and perceive groups as being individuals who are similar. And we can talk about grouping people in other ways. But often when we actually do work together in a group, in other words, group work, it is not so much the similarity or dissimilarity of individuals that constitutes the group, because particularly in our classes, the group members can be very different. They can disagree. They can be different in terms of their ability. They can be different in terms of their motivation. But as Kurt Levine mentions here, it's the interdependence of fate. In other words, they have a shared mission, a shared goal. Think about a business context. You have to work in an office with the same 4 people. You may like one of them, you may dislike another one, the other one may be in the middle, but you still have to work together to get on. And in this sense, the same skills that we need in business and in any work context are often the skills that we want our students to learn in the classroom. And this is the point that Levine is making, that we can't necessarily choose the members of our groups in real life, and the same is true in the classroom. And Morten Deutsch makes this point: the crux of the difference between cooperation and competition lies in how the goals of the participants are linked. In a cooperative situation, the goals are so linked that everybody sinks or swims together. In other words, they succeed or they fail together. Whereas in a competitive situation, for me to succeed, you must fail, i.e. one swims and the other sink. And that is the important difference here, that there is a sense in which the shared fate means that we all have to work together effectively to succeed. And this links to the 2 key principles underpinning cooperative learning that I would argue are often glossed over or simply not known about by a lot of writing on collaborative learning. And I'll come on to those in a moment. But this key point being here that if we do an activity and there isn't this interdependence of fate, we can expect that the activity will be less successful than if there is, all other things considered equal. So let's look at the 2 key principles of cooperative learning that have come out of this. The first one is what is generally agreed, and all of the writers on cooperative learning generally recognize this. We call it positive interdependence. For an activity to be truly cooperative, learners must work as a team, not in competition with each other. Okay, so if in the members of a group, if they're doing an activity where they're actually competing, for example, a card game, then that isn't actually group work. That's people working in a group, but it isn't group work according to cooperative learning theory. Okay, some of the writers do recognize that competition between teams is acceptable in cooperative learning. Others don't. They don't even see that as being necessarily valid. My personal opinion there is that it can work, particularly when we're working with higher education learners, as most of you are, if not all of you, then it can work well. But often inter-team competition at primary level sometimes doesn't work very well for reasons that we can all probably guess. And the second principle is individual accountability. So let's go back to that example that Ersin mentioned, and several of you mentioned it, where you have one learner in a group who isn't really participating. The key question that we're always interested in asking ourselves is, how can I make that student participate in the group more? Let's call that student Kadir. Okay, so I've got a group of 4 learners, and one of them is Kadir. And Kadir doesn't really like English. He doesn't see it as relevant. He doesn't want to participate. So the argument behind cooperative learning is that if we ensure that Kadir and everybody else contributes to the activity and has to contribute for everyone to succeed, then that should enable him to learn and to benefit from the group work, not only from practicing his English skills, which is our priority as English teachers, but also from learning the social skills that he may need more than his classmates if he isn't, interested in working in a group as much. So this idea of individual accountability, that group success depends on contributions from all of them, making them accountable not just for their own learning, but for the success of the group. That peer pressure that happens is necessary for group work to be effective. Each learner is accountable for the success of the group. And of course, I'll come back to in a moment some specific examples of this so you can use those in the future. So 2 questions here, which I've got, and I want you to focus on the second of these, just because it will work better, I think, using the chat. Why are these principles important? I think you can probably reflect on those personally, but feel free to also mention that in the chat. But do you feel that you do any activities that involve positive interdependence and individual accountability? Feel free to mention the name of the activity or even write a short description in the chat there. And this is one of those questions that is going to take a little bit of thinking. So I'll just continue talking while some of you are writing. I can see some of you already looking at your keyboards. And here's a couple of images which are interesting, I think. These will maybe give us some clues for the activity. I'm just going to take a drink of water while we're thinking. Some of you mentioned some of them earlier. When I asked you to mention your favorite activities, several of them I thought are definitely potential ways of ensuring positive interdependence and individual accountability. Would anybody like to share 1 or 2 ideas? Great, we've got some ideas here. Okay, great. Thank you. Kadir, I'm going to leave that one until later, actually. It's a really good example. Bashak, I'm just going to read out yours if I may. Sometimes I assign them roles. Yeah, this is a really simple way that we can do with almost any activity. Thank you for that, Bashak. Like one of them is the chairperson. One of them is maybe the scribe, the secretary. And that by that way of doing it, we can even give them roles that are comfortable, and even getting them to decide upon the roles. Having the same 4 roles can work quite well. That works particularly well with secondary learners, but I suspect it will work with the undergraduate students as well. Yep. And Julio says reporting back tasks can be useful. Definitely. Again, that can be a role which, even if a student doesn't participate in the task so much, reporting back can help them to do that. A lot of the task-based learning literature does not focus on these challenges and issues. They assume that the task itself requires everyone to participate. But a discussion task, that isn't always true. And then is this Bereshin? Berin. I sometimes ask my students to create a story as a whole group activity, each group creating a different part of the story. Yeah, nice. So one of the challenges there is that you might put them in groups of 3 to write a story or to write part of the story, and 2 of them do the majority of it. What do you do with a student who doesn't contribute to the story so much, who just waits and maybe uses their phone? Class debates, thank you for that, Hilal. Students have time to get ready before the discussion, definitely. They share the workload and encourage each other to generate ideas and use English correctly. Great, great, great. All good ideas and things that we can do to encourage it, but they don't kind of guarantee that everybody participate. The examples we've got here, several of them, don't necessarily require everyone to contribute in order for it to work effectively. So let's have a look at some of the activities which we often use in CLT, communicative language teaching. Yes, nice. Creating a sense of group as well. Yeah, good. So these 5 example activities that we all probably know well, and several of you mentioned earlier, and Kadira just mentioned Jigsaw, and we'll come on to that as a key one. These all originated in the cooperative learning movement. Jigsaw reading or jigsaw interactions come from the work of, my God, I've forgotten his name, Aaron, my God, sorry, my mind's gone blank. Anyway, yes, jigsaw activities come from cooperative learning, and there was a book written about them in the 1970s. Oh, Aronson, thank you. There we go. My brain is getting old. So Aronson wrote a book about jigsaw in 1970, and in it he describes a specific set of requirements for a jigsaw to be cooperative, and we'll look at those in a moment. Information gap activities are examples of cooperative learning activities. Describe and draw, as you can see in the picture, one child has a picture and the other one is trying to describe what they're seeing. Onion ring discussions, that was one of those complex activities where there's a group of students facing outwards in an inner circle, students facing inwards in an outer circle, and they had a quick chat and then moved and chat, moved and chat, moved and chat. It's kind of one of those things that you often do a lot when you're training teachers, but I don't think I've ever used it in a classroom myself. It's just too logistically challenging. Whereas find someone who is the classic mingle activity that most of us know. Find someone who has been to Ankara, for example. Find someone who has eaten a specific food, for example, and so on. So all of these have their origins in cooperative learning. But I think something was lost when communicative language teaching imported these activities, because it imported them without necessarily getting us to reflect on why students should participate in them. The assumption was that they will all be motivated, they'll all be willing to engage, but that isn't always the case. And it's more and more true as English language teaching moves more into primary and secondary contexts. It's always a challenge that we have trying to get learners to do this, to do it in English and for everyone to participate. So let's have a look at some activities now that do draw upon the cooperative learning theory in ways that will hopefully get everybody to participate. So as Kadira mentioned in the feedback there, Jigsaw is a really good example of this. And I'll show an example of this in a moment. Each student in a group gets, for example, a short text. They can't show it to each other, but must summarize the content. This enables them to complete a task. And if the task is simply tell each other about your context, about your content, that doesn't guarantee that the students will participate. In other words, that's not a cooperative jigsaw. The second one is called STAD, Student Team Achievement Division. This is something that again works better at secondary levels. It looks quite a teacher-centered lesson, and you can see almost a PPP framework here, but there's an important stage in there to highlight. After teacher presents the lesson contents, the group check that they have all understood the presentation. Then they undergo individual quizzes to check what they've learned. They receive individual scores, and then the team score itself is a summary of that. So the team success is dependent on all the group members doing well. Sounds quite a lot of pressure for the individual learners, but let's look at a way to do it more communicatively. Okay, so let's say we take the example of, oh, and by the way, it comes from the work of Bob Slavin, 1995 book, but he was working on this in the 1960s and 70s as well. So let's imagine we're teaching a group of elementary learners how to tell the time, okay? After a teacher presentation where you teach them how to say o'clock and half past and quarter to and 25 minutes to, the group then work in teams and they use a clock kind of diagram using a pencil to practice drawing in times and getting each other to tell the time. And the aim of this stage is for them to continue until all the team members are able to tell the time and to spell the words correctly if that's required for the test. Okay. Then after they've done that, they then do the individual quiz. So they write their name, they work individually, and they write the answers to the 8 questions in this example quiz. And then they receive an individual improvement score and team recognition as a result. So that's a simple example of how one activity can get the students to work together. And this essentially involves peer teaching to ensure that everybody is capable of completing the quiz. Good at secondary level, higher primary, good for more traditional teacher-centered lessons, but probably not something which you guys are going to be likely doing so much at Anadolu University. Let's have a look at jigsaws. Jigsaws are the classic cooperative learning activity. Elliot Aronson, I now remember his full name, came up with them in the 1970s. Let's have a look at a classic jigsaw activity where you've got several different texts in which individuals give their own idea or content. So let's have a look at texts about people at work. And the first example I'm giving you is what I'm going to call an uncooperative jigsaw. So we've got 4 texts. The students have to read their individual texts and just check the answer to a simple question, i.e., what is the job of the person in question? So there's text B. The person in question happens to be a comedian. There's text A and the questions. Oh, yeah, one second. I was just going to do it. Yeah. So there's 2 examples of the text. I'll show you the other 2 texts in a moment. And you can see here, these are the typical questions that many, not all course books, ask students to report. And essentially, it requires the students to be motivated to do the activity in order for the activity to proceed and to go well. They just have to tell each other what is the job, where do they work, and how much do they earn. Fairly straightforward stuff. But these are not cooperative learning questions. Let me change those for questions that are cooperative. If you change those questions, which are now on the right of my screen, with the ones on the left, students have to compare all the text they got in order to answer them. And by the way, we also use a really useful bit of grammar here that we all have to teach, superlatives. So if we ask the question, who works hardest? Who makes the most money? Who has the most difficult job? Who is happiest? And which of the 4 jobs would you prefer? To answer that question, the students have to not just listen to, but to make sure that every group member tells the others about their job. And they have to even compare and discuss. So to work out who works harder, they have to discuss the number of hours they do each day, the number of tasks they do, and so on. And I would argue that these are cooperative questions, because they require that interaction, the positive interdependence that is necessary for everybody to participate. And here are the other 2 texts. Carla, can't remember actually. Oh, she works for an NGO. And this one here, Matt, who I remember is a gardener. Okay. So as you can see, when they've got those 4 texts and they're working in a group of 4, they have to discuss really carefully just to answer any one of those questions. Even the question, who makes the most money, isn't easy to answer, because one of them is talking about how much they make a month. The other is talking about how much they make a year or per gig, and so on and so forth. So it requires a lot of interaction, and it's necessary for all 4 people to contribute for them to answer those questions. So there we go. That is what I would argue and what I perceive to be a cooperative jigsaw activity. It requires all the learners to participate. And that in itself requires the teacher to plan and prepare that activity really well. And if necessary, to reject the textbooks that are given in pre-assigned materials such as course books and to replace them with other ones. Let's have a look at a different type of jigsaw, the text division jigsaw. Imagine you've got a story, as one of you, in fact, I think mentioned, and the story, you can separate it out into sections. So you separate it out into 4 sections. And this is an old story from King Arthur, the Knights of the Round Table, King Arthur's tales, called Gawain's Choice. I think that's how you pronounce his first name. And I've broken it up into 4 different parts. Okay. And so here's 3 different parts, sorry. Here's a very simple question. How could we make this activity a cooperative learning activity? Feel free to suggest in the chat. As it is, the students could just retell each other their part of the story. Or even worse, they could just read it out loud. And that really wouldn't be of much use at all. And I think we've all been in that situation where the students aren't really processing the content, they're just reading out loud. So a very, very simple question. How could we make this cooperative so that they have to listen to each other in order to succeed as a whole group? Any ideas? Okay, let me give you the answer. Some of you are typing, apologies. Ordering, yes, Kadir. That's basically it. Of course it was. I bet you're all thinking that. Just Kadir had the courage to say it. Yeah. Oops. So here's a synthesis question. So basically what Kadir is saying, we need to get them to order it. Because in order to order the three sections of the story, they have to listen to each other to understand each other. So imagine you've got that student who doesn't want to speak in the class, who I confusingly also called Kadir. Um, if Kadira doesn't contribute, they can't put the three story sections in the right order. So it's as simple as that. And I sometimes call this a synthesis question, a question that requires them to synthesize all of the content of the activity in order for it to succeed. So it's all about the design of the activities or tasks you use in the classroom. Yeah, and absolutely, Barish. We want the other students to retell a particular part of the story. That could work as well, for example. And call, yeah, information gaps. Yeah. Yeah, definitely, if we had more quotes. So let's have a look at another type of activity that several of you mentioned, both as your favorites and ones which can potentially be cooperative. The problem about a discussion activity, and we've all done this, you put students in groups to discuss the topic. Two of the students have a really good discussion. Another two contribute one or two ideas. And maybe there's one or two who just kind of lurk, as we say sometimes using online language. They just don't really contribute. They may be picking up their mobile phone. They're not really present in the lesson. So how to make a discussion activity cooperative? Let's imagine you've got a discussion such as this one. So you've got a problem. This town called Dunlin, which looks suspiciously like London, actually, it's getting bigger, and the main airport is not enough to cope with the increased air travel. And there are three options: build a new airport at site A, expand the current airport, or build a superfast rail link to the city to encourage train travel. Now, as a discussion, again, you'd have the same problem that some of the students would participate well, others wouldn't necessarily participate so well. So the way to do this, and somebody's just mentioned this, I think, yes, Julia, there we go, to add an information gap. So how would that work? So student A gets a bit of extra information about site A. So the estimated cost, the estimated time span, the pros and cons, right? Student B gets the same extra information, but about option B. So to expand the current airport to build a new runway, the cost, the time span, and the pros and cons. And student C gets information about the third option. So just as Julia suggested there, you're adding on extra information to the discussion activity so that each student has useful information to contribute. Again, if our reticent student, the one who doesn't want to speak, doesn't contribute, then they won't get all the information and they won't solve the task to the best of their ability. So something like this can be a useful addition to a discussion activity. It often requires us to prepare more materials, but once you've done it, you can often use those materials again and again, and it will encourage more effective learning than if you didn't have that extra information gap. So well done, Julia. You predicted exactly what I was going to say. So now let's move on to our second discussion activity, getting the groups right. Here are three questions that I'd like you to discuss in your breakout rooms. And Kadira, what we might do this time is we create breakout rooms of about 5 or 6 that will ensure that they all should have about the same number. So Confusingly, in your breakout rooms, I'd like you to discuss the following questions. What group sizes work best in your classrooms? Do you choose the groups or do you let the students choose who they go with? If you choose, how do you decide who to put together? In other words, what criteria? And do you vary the groups or do you keep the same groups each lesson? Okay, so let's do 5-minute discussion there. How are we doing for time? Yeah, we'll do 5-minute discussion there. And then when we come back, it'll be interesting to hear your ideas in the chat. Feel free to start typing those in the chat while you're in your groups. Okay, Kadir?
Okay.
Okay, welcome back, guys. Just wait a little bit for everyone to come back. Those of you who are here, feel free to share some of your ideas in the meeting chat. So if you have an answer to question 1, just write number 1 and write it there. Number 2, add that. And creative ideas, include them as well. We're starting to get some really interesting ideas in the group, in the individual discussions, and it's nice to share those to benefit from everyone's expertise. We had a very important point made by Umit. Absolutely true that um, it always depends on the task, on the activity to some extent, obviously, and that some of them do require larger groups and smaller ones. Um, and Meral has mentioned that point as well. Thank you for that, Meral. But I suppose I'm choosing kind of what's your go-to norm for groups. We also had Meral mention the important point in our group that if there's only a few students in the class, like 10 students, you've only got certain limitations, like 2 groups of 3 and 1 group of 4 kind of thing is your basic go-to. So let's have a look. Yeah, groups of 3. So 3 to 4 is the general average there. And I wonder where your rationale for that group size has come from. Um, and Gökhan makes this really important point. Generally, pairs. If in doubt, pairs is often easier, isn't it? It's less likely to fail pair work. Every day, a different person, if possible. That's interesting. It makes them closer and work better, and varying the group. So Gökhan is in that kind of group where there's lots of specific and chosen variation. Um, hmm. So Julia doesn't have too much difficulty. And of course, when you've got 12, the maths mean you've got groups of 3, 4, or 6. Yeah, 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 great. Thank you for that, Sinead. And as often as possible for varying it. Yeah. Bashak. So we've got what we've got here is basically kind of a consensus that 3 to 4 is about right. And Ersin makes this same point again about it depends on the task. And Ersin is more in the category of letting them decide. And Ersin, when we were in the group chat, we're in the same group again. Mentioned this important point that at the start of the term, when the learners are a little bit more nervous, it's often a good idea just to let them to find their comfortable space in the classroom. And I agree with that completely. Let's have a look at what the cooperative learning literature says. It probably won't surprise you too much, but this is based as well on a range of different theories in psychology. So the most important group in cooperative learning, can you see that slide? Okay, yeah, I'm sharing. Is what they sometimes call home groups or base groups, depending on the writer. The most typical format for cooperative learning is these groups, and they include 4 to 5 learners, sometimes 3 to 4. And Kagan is one of them, Spencer Kagan, who writes about this. The Johnson brothers, who also are big experts on cooperative learning, generally agree with this. And the majority of the group work is done in these home groups, okay? And these are heterogeneous groups. So again, let's put ourselves back in the secondary classroom where this comes from, because we need to be critical about its application to your tertiary contexts. But the basic idea is these students are with each other for the whole academic year. And for one term, for example, Spencer Kagan will create home groups, which will be mixed ability. So there'll be one student who's strong in the lesson topic. And remember, cooperative learning is from mainstream education. So in our topic, that would be one learner who is probably high proficiency, one learner who is low proficiency for the class average. So if our class is, say, B1 class, there may be one who's close to B2, one who's close to A2, and they would be put in the same group with two students who are more typical for the level. And that they get to know each other and do the majority of their group work in their home group. But importantly, the teacher actually assigns them this group and allows them to develop an identity in this group. So we can often get them to create their own name for the group, cards. We can even have spaces using online tools, for example, Padlet, or when we are giving feedback to activities, each group can have their own page on a Google document and so on and so forth. So they gain a sense of shared identity, and they also get to know each other, to know what each other's personalities are like. But just like in many work situations, we, the teacher, kind of take that executive decision, at least after letting them get used to working together, as I think this is an important piece of advice that Ersin made. But we eventually kind of say, okay, no, I'm going to put you in these groups, and we specify them. And these home groups stick together for the majority of their learning. But we sometimes need to create exceptions. And a really good exception is if we're doing a jigsaw activity. So in a jigsaw activity, learners work in groups, but they can also work in two types of group. So in jigsaw, you sometimes use what we call expert groups. And expert groups are homogeneous groups of similar academic ability. And they interact with new content and complete exercises in their content in their expert groups. Traditionally, this was used for what we sometimes call differentiation, that you'd put learners into ability level groupings and give the learners at a higher ability a more difficult task. In the UK, in mainstream education, we're moving away from the idea of differentiation. Many of my colleagues at the Centre for Teacher Education at Warwick here talk about adaptive learning rather than differentiation, because the problem of differentiation is that if you give some learners a low-level task, it kind of labels them as low level, implies they can't achieve the same outcome as others. But let's look at the example of jigsaw. So imagine we've got a jigsaw activity and one of the four texts is longer and more complex. In that sense, it kind of makes sense to kind of choose, okay, I'll choose those students to work on that text. So you put them in an expert group to read that text first, share their ideas together before they then go to the jigsaw groups where they compare the different texts and try to synthesize what they've read from the different texts. So in that sense, expert groups work well with jigsaws, putting four stronger students together with a more difficult text and four weaker students together with the easier text. You don't need to tell them that. Obviously, you wouldn't use the phrase expert groups in the class, but it will enable both all the students to be challenged and everyone to perceive that they've done pretty well, that they've succeeded, and then to contribute when they go back to their home group for the main jigsaw exchange activity. So in that sense, jigsaws can work well using a combination of home groups and expert groups. But the idea of expert groups is also a useful one to have in those situations where we need our learners or we want to give our learners slightly different tasks to challenge them differently. Now, obviously, individual work and pair work are also important. Both of these can happen within home groups. So the ideal home group situation would allow for pairs of two or even a group of three, as well as the group of four, so that we can vary between those. And typically within cooperative learning, the home group of 4 or 5, each student would have a partner that they work with a lot. So a higher ability student might be partnered with a lower ability student to enable peer learning to happen. And importantly, what happens there is that lower ability student will often learn quite quickly from the extra support they get from their peer, meaning that the difference in ability within the class reduces rather than increases, which is the problem of using too much expert group work. And another important point to mention, I'm sure you all know this, but of course we all have neurodivergent learners. Conditions such as attention deficit hyperactive disorder, ADHD, we call it sometimes in English, or autism, can make it really difficult for students to work together in groups. And that's why Ersin's point, I think, is really important. Allowing them to find their space in the class at the start of the term is also important because it enables us to identify, and hopefully we will learn of any important documentation that tells us there's learners there who may not benefit as well from group work. Sometimes these learners can work well with a trusted partner. There'll be a student that they maybe can connect to better, and chatting to them in a tutorial will help us to find out what their needs are and how they prefer to work when group work is happening. Often they also don't want to be left out, so they're often in a difficult double bind situation when it comes to group work and pair work. So there we go. Let's have a quick look at some of the research evidence underpinning cooperative learning. How do we know that it works? Well, there's been a huge amount of research conducted on it. Johnson & Johnson's meta-analysis identifies over 1,200 studies. And whilst Johnson & Johnson are very much biased towards cooperative learning, they're two of the big authors who write a lot about it. John Hattie essentially looked at it from a more objective perspective in his very well-known meta-analysis report called Visible Learning. And he noted that there seems to be universal agreement that it is effective. And in both his and Marsano's meta-analyses, they find that it has anything between 0.41 to 0.73 effect size difference using Cohen's d, which means that basically it increases learning within an academic year by about 40% to 70%. That learners could potentially learn about half as much again during the same period of time. Okay, so it indicates that it works really well, but let's be critical. That's mainstream education, and that's for subject-specific education, so learning geography, history, maths, and so on. There are some anecdotal reports of the positive impact of cooperative learning from English language contexts, but those are more limited. Ning looks at it in Southeast Asia and Panwan in Pakistan as well. But it's important to note that over 90% of the studies that Johnson and et al. Looked at were conducted in North America. So this is a methodology that isn't just proven to work mainly in North America, it also originates in North American contexts. And that's a reason for us to be critical of it as well, that we need to ask the questions, are the same conditions that they had there in those secondary education studies true about our classes in Anadolu University higher education context? And that's the question that we always need to be critical of when looking at this research. So implementing cooperative learning. If you're interested in using cooperative learning in your own classrooms and you like some of the ideas here, a couple of really obvious tips here, and I think most of you will know most of these, but some of them, might be useful as well to go through. So starting gradually, choose an activity you like and a class that you like. They will be more forgiving. They will also give you useful feedback on the activity when you do it with them. You can prepare the learners carefully. So the first time you're doing it, you may need to explain the rationale for cooperative learning, what you're going to do and why you think they will learn from it, mentioning that a key part of this is learning to work together, even with students who you may not choose to work with. And we can always mention that they'll need to do this in their future work or in their other studies at the university. So kind of create that rationale so that they understand that you're not doing it either to punish them or for any other reason, but you're doing it because it's a natural condition for how we do group work in the world beyond the classroom. We do it because of shared intentionality, not because we're necessarily all friends. Choose and adapt materials as required. So for example, to take the jigsaw example, sometimes the questions in the course book don't require that synthesis of information. So feel free to adapt and change the questions to make sure that everybody has to contribute. And keep groups simple to start with, exactly as you guys have suggested. First of all, you might want to try pair work or what we call sometimes convenience grouping, which is basically whoever they've sat down next to, put them in groups. It's faster. There doesn't need to be a rationale for doing it that way. But then look at how well they work together and start to consider specific chosen ability groups where you go away from the classroom, decide who's going to work in groups, come back and tell them, okay, for the next 4 lessons, I'd like you to work in the following groups. And that usually works well if you've got good attendance. If attendance is a bit erratic and 2 or 3 students sometimes don't show up, maybe create a slightly larger group, groups of 5, so that you still have groups of 4 if 1 or 2 of them don't arrive. And manage noise levels and language choice patiently. If you've just got 10 or 12 in your class and they're all higher education, this shouldn't be an issue. But if you're working in a context where you've got 20 or 30 learners, noise can be a massive problem. And the other issue is the use of L1. Trying to encourage them away from using L1 is important, and it will often happen more when they enjoy the activity. And that's one of the challenges. So often I would say manage this individually. When you see a learner who is the first one to switch to the first language, to Turkish, then maybe just chat to that learner after the lesson so that you improve it for the future, rather than simply saying, don't speak Turkish, speak English, because there may be sometimes important reasons why they need to make use of Turkish. For example, that student didn't understand something, the instruction, the activity, a bit of vocabulary. So rather than having a blanket speak only English, manage it more intelligently and differentiate in that sense. Find out who the ones are who switch to Turkish, learn why, and then try to encourage them to use more English, and so on. And importantly, you guys all know this, I'm sure, praise the ones who do it well at the end of the activity, specifically for their use of English. Oh, wow, guys, you did brilliantly there. And I noticed you did it all in English. Great job. You know, that kind of thing works even at university level. The students really appreciate that positive feedback. So there we go. A couple of extra slides before we move on to the questions. Here are some of the tools and strategies that we often use in a cooperative learning classroom. I bet you use many of these yourselves. So think, pair, share. We know this activity. You pose a question, ask the students to think of their own answer, then to tell a partner, just one of a student. And then they share it with the whole class. By sharing it with a partner, they get confidence in their answer, and the partner can correct them if they've, for some reason, misunderstood the question or have an answer which maybe they don't want to share in front of the whole class, because they will feel vulnerable if they do. Another activity is really simple. Pass the pen. To get everyone to contribute, each student writes one sentence. You know, some of you are mentioning the story writing activity, and then they pass it to the next student who writes a sentence, and it goes around the class, also called round robin. And using a pass the pen activity is a really simple way of getting everyone to contribute. Even if that reluctant student, going back to Kadir, doesn't want to participate, Kadir still has to write something, even if other people dictate it to him. And even then, he's learning skills, he's participating, and he feels a sense of obligation to contribute. Mini whiteboards are really useful. If you can see in the picture there, these students have got little whiteboards that they can write their answers to. So for example, if you're using STAD, that activity I showed with the clock telling activity, each group can show their whiteboard at the same time. So you can see all of the answers simultaneously. One of the advantages of using a group chat in this kind of thing, you're doing something like that yourself. You're able to present your own whiteboard of your own ideas in the same space. But in a classroom, mini whiteboards work really well, and students can present their group ideas together at the same time. Random nomination. This is something which has been promoted in the UK by a writer called Dylan William a lot, that it's important that we don't always choose or allow the same strong students to contribute, particularly when we ask for answers to questions. This tends to lead to the stronger students getting stronger and the weaker students becoming more passive, not participating, and then they get distracted by other things. Their motivation level drops. Random nomination could be achieved by using sticks like these ones. Can you see these sticks here where you've got, they're like coffee stirrers. Each student has a name on it. And when you have an important question, you put them all into a container like a cup or a glass, and you take one stick out of the glass randomly, and that is the person who has to answer the question. The first time you do it, the students will be quite nervous, but the advantage of it is that every student in the group needs to know the answer to the question. And what you then see happening is in the discussion before you get the answer to the question, the students will work together to check that they know the answer. If it's a think, pair, share, they'll discuss with their partner more carefully. And if they don't know the answer, they'll listen to their partner to get it. And if it's a group work activity, the group should try to make sure that everybody in the group knows the answer to the question. And the other option that I often use myself, one of the few online tools I use regularly, is Padlet, because it provides a kind of a similarity to a a mini whiteboard, that the students presenting their group ideas in the same space that we can see at the same time and compare. And the great thing about Padlet, they can do so anonymously if they need to, and they can also vote up or vote down ideas, priorities, and so they can do things like a rank ordering exercise effectively. So there we go. Hopefully some useful ideas for cooperative learning. Just by the way, if you're interested, one of my publications is a book on cooperative learning for the Delta Publishing Ideas in Action series. I'm not going to ask you to buy it. I'm going to give you a free sample section at the end of this talk, because I like people to be critical of other people's approaches. It does have lots of ideas and introductions. In the sample section, I'm going to show you a link to. It's got the introduction and a few sample activities in there. So I'm not using this primarily to sell the book, but it's there if you want to get a copy of it. So there we go. And here are the references and the further reading for the talk. The first of the QR codes should take you to my slides for the talk, hopefully. I'm just going to check that's true. Yep, that takes you to the slides for the talk. And the second one should take you to the handout I was mentioning, an extract from that book, so you can try out one or two of the activities in your class. And like all books in the Delta Publishing Ideas in Action series, it encourages teachers to adapt, to develop the ideas themselves, but never simply to take other people's ideas and use them in their own classroom without thinking about it, because adaptation is the key to making sure it's appropriate for our learners. Cool, great. Now, how have we done time-wise? So we've got about 10 minutes left, Kadir, I think, for questions, comments, criticisms, heckling. Let's move over to that.
I can just tell people that I have a copy of the book, Jason, with
Oh,
me.
do you?
So if anybody is interested, just feel free to contact me and I'll share the book with you.
That's great, yeah. And because it's a photocopyable, you can copy that book as much
Yeah.
as you like and
Yeah.
use it in your different departments without breaching copyright. So
Yeah.
that's great. One of the nice things about those kind of books.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. So time for questions. Anybody got any questions? Any thoughts? Anything I've said that maybe you don't think might work so well as well in your classroom? Anything you'd be critical of about cooperative learning and its origins? Who would
Uh,
like to share?
I
Yes.
don't have a question, but I really enjoyed your talk and learned a lot. Thank you very much indeed. But now I have to go because I'll be teaching at 4 o'clock. I have
Oh,
I have an online teaching. I teach linguistics to the students of Turkish language. Okay, so thank you very much appreciated. And come
teşekkürler,
back
Umut.
again. Okay. All right.
Thank you so much. Teşekkürler. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Other people, any questions, any thoughts?
Yeah.
Feel free to type it in the chat or to just speak. Oh, Errol's going to speak. Yeah.
Yeah, I might have a question. I really appreciate, all the things that you've presented. What I wonder, do you have any suggestions, or does it differentiate, because we are teaching at universities and we have almost adult students here? Do you think that we should differ in some kind of activities, or should we keep all the activities the same, like you do it within all age groups?
What's your feeling, Errol? Because I think implicit in your question is a suggestion that maybe some of this isn't necessary or isn't useful at university level.
You're a good analyzer. The thing is, well, what you suggested is something that all of us, in the pair discussions or group discussions we've made, already are incorporating. But sometimes it is like, with the age difference, that we already have motivated students, and we have students with metacognitive strategies who are dealing very well with explaining themselves, incorporating these strategies. What I wonder, is there a stronger suggestion, especially, that you have with university students that would work better rather than Padlet, let's say?
Well, Padlet is just one of the tools that we might use, but I think a couple of important reflections here. A lot of the time we talk in education about social and emotional learning nowadays. And what we encapsulate under that is the ability to know yourself and to know others and to interact with them in the classroom. I think even at university level, and in certain countries, I think it's stronger, but even in, say, the UK or in Turkey, some of the students still haven't developed very good social skills, emotional skills. They come to class with the wrong body language, the wrong attitude, and sometimes they need a little bit of encouragement to make sure they know not only that they have to work together, and that's an important part of learning English, but that will be a predictor of their future needs, that they'll have to get on in social environments. So I think at university level, what I would do is I would do a lot more of when I mentioned this idea of preparing the learners, explaining to them why we're doing this activity, why I'm putting you in these specific groups, and why I want you to demonstrate your ability to succeed as a group. As you say, they've got the metacognitive skills to know this. University students should be expert learners by their age, but they're not always. And I think an important element of that is developing those social and emotional skills. So I would say, yeah, once you're comfortable with a class, do try out some of these specific grouping strategies of heterogeneous groups, with you choosing the groups and saying to the students, these are the groups, this is how we're going to do it. Let's try it like this for a few lessons. And then giving them activities that require the positive interdependence, see how well it goes. And that will often enable the less or force, to put it in more direct terms, the less motivated learners to participate, because they need to participate for everyone to succeed. And that will solve, in a very simplistic sense, one of the problems that came up a lot at the start of this webinar, but it could create other problems, i.e. students do want to work with their best friend. They don't want to get into that group, and so on and so forth. And managing those personalities will be a key part of the challenge that you guys will take forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Good question there.
Mhm. I have a question to Jason.
Yes.
Do you think these cooperative activities are mostly good for speaking and writing skills, developing those skills, or could they be useful in presenting language or teaching some vocabulary, grammar in a cooperative way?
Good question. Well, the activity STAD, Student Team Achievement Division, is designed
Yeah.
for typical lessons where you've got presentation and practice. And in that sense, you could use them. Basically, Bob Slavin's idea is that you do the presentation and then you give the students time in their home groups to check that they've all got it.
Okay.
So let's imagine we're teaching a difficult bit of grammar, let's say present perfect tense for life experience, right? And we know they're going to make mistakes because we know our students and they're going to make this kind of mistakes. So we present them with the activity and we present them with a few erroneous sentence, and we get them to work first of all in their groups to identify the errors. In that situation, the students, if they're in their home groups, what can and should happen is that the stronger students should coach the weaker students to identify the errors rather than simply telling them the answers. And then checking they understand the answers. So giving them meta-linguistic questions, such as which of these sentences are wrong? Why do you think they're wrong? Can you identify what the correct sentence is and what the rule is? And making sure that in the group, the stronger students, the higher ability students, hold back a little bit. And with regard to explicit language knowledge, the higher ability students aren't always the ones who are kind of higher ability when it comes to communication, but that they work together as a group to do that. And then it's followed by an individual check or test in which they then have to demonstrate that they've all got it. That's something I've seen done really, really effectively in more what we call traditional teacher-centered lessons, extremely well in some countries and contexts. And it's particularly effective when the students have an exam that has that kind of knowledge and they have to demonstrate it. We don't have control over what the exam is, but they still have to do it. And in those situations, I think it will work really well. And if you enjoy teaching in that way and you feel it's useful for your learners, then yes, definitely. That's one way of doing it. Other ways of doing it, would take me a little bit of time to think. Definitely receptive skills activities they can do. And there's one of those, the old wood carver, I think, in that book. But yeah, other activities as well.
Mhm. Okay, thank you.
Just going to check actually. Any more questions? Okay, thank you. And thank you for that nice comment, Gökhan and Hulya. That's really nice. That's great. And feel free to share your ideas as well. If you're on Facebook, I'm on there usually, and it's nice to share ideas for activities and lessons there as well. Thank you so much for coming.
Okay, so are you going to finish, Jason?
Yes, I think we are finishing there, aren't we? Doesn't look like there's any more questions coming, and I bet you guys have all got lots of preparation and lessons to go to. I've got a seminar in half an hour, so I've got to
Okay, all right.
got to have lunch as
Thank
well.
you.
So, yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, guys, thank you for coming along. Bye bye.
Thank you very much, Jason. Nice meeting you.
Cheers. Thank you, Mehmet. Nice to meet you too.